What is up, everybody? Mark on the mic. Across from me, Mr. Ryan Muckenhirn. Ryan, how are you?
Mark, I'm well. You're starting off strong with a new water bottle today.
Yeah, you like that?
I do.
It was. It's nice. It's a Yeti. It's a Live Wild brand.
What
from our friend Remy Warren.
What do you got
really
in there?
That is just a salt supplement.
No kidding.
Yeah, adds a little flavor. It doesn't taste just like salt water.
Just a little zip.
Yeah.
Well,
not
cool.
what we're talking about today.
No.
Listeners might be like, oh man, they're going to talk about salt supplements. You know, comment below if you're interested in hearing about like water supplements. I'd be curious. Because I wanted to do a podcast on water supplements at one time. Shot down.
All right.
So maybe this will either be my vindication or they'll be like, yeah, no, that's like not a good idea. Boring. I don't think so, man. I think there's some science to it, some physiology with our bodies.
Sure.
When and how you wanted it. Anyway, okay. The topic of today's this intro was a misfire, Ryan.
I disagree.
But the topic of today's podcast is muzzleloader misfires. How do we prevent them?
Oh, yeah.
How do we prevent Muzzy Misfires? Actually,
Sure.
I think that's how we'll frame it in the old title with the thumbnail. A couple years ago, Ryan, I've muzzleloaded for many years.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, I was on a Midwest late season whitetail hunt.
Yep.
Got a little lazy.
Yep.
And wasn't, reloading, things like that. Maybe I took the muzzleloader from the stand, threw it in the vehicle a few times for some short stints.
Yep.
Excuse me. Getting choked up here. Got an opportunity late in the hunt. Actually, we did a film on this, so spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. But also, it's probably worth tuning in. I thought it was pretty good. Got an opportunity at the end of the hunt at a doe. Squeezed the trigger, and the recoil was that of probably less than a .22. It made a very odd sound, and the deer began its departure before the bullet hit the ground in front of the deer.
I remember the phone call, Mark. Mark had called me livid.
I was not livid.
You weren't happy. You had a lot of questions as to how this could happen.
Well, I think I knew, but I was just like, what do you think happened? Like, because I was hypothesizing myself. I mean, it was a bummer because, we're trying to, make a good fit. In the end, actually, I think it was actually better than actually getting the doe because
Sure.
it's like
it can happen to you.
more lessons to be learned there.
Yeah.
But it left me some questions and like, okay, well, how do you prevent a Muzzy misfire? Like, I think we can talk through that one.
Sure.
As a single example of what we think might have happened, and then we can go kind of through maybe a checklist or a protocol, things to do, best practices. So when your moment of truth arrives, you don't just have only the primer go off, or you get a weird, discharge like I did, whatever.
Yeah, there's a couple different types of misfires that we should look at, perhaps. So what Mark had experienced was like either a polluted powder charge, meaning it got thermal cycled, moved from cold to hot, and like condensation had formed, and it had kind of muted the performance of your powder. So there was ignition.
Powder doesn't like moisture, condensation.
Typically not.
H2O.
Yeah, typically not. So it was either that or your projectile had walked forward in your bore.
I don't think that's the case.
It may not be, but they would manifest much the same way. Mark's gun did go off. There was fire and smoke. But the result was, think about throwing a dart at your local beer league dart game. It flies forward and hits the board. Mark's projectile just simply kind of out the barrel. If
Tom Leatherberry is listening right now, his ears just really perked up because he loves darts and similar games.
I bet he's a pool shark too.
Bar games.
Yeah. That makes sense.
He loves the podcast and bar games.
Yeah. I bet he carries a 4-piece cue in his sleeve.
Oh, he brings his own.
And he like pulls it out. I wasn't going to do this, and he screws it together, and then he takes everybody for $20.
I don't play much, and then
So Mark's situation, in which he has ignition, but he has muted performance, is likely resultant of thermal cycling his rifle, which in turn degraded the kind of tenacity of his charge. And you end up with the ball just kind of coming out the end of the barrel, as opposed to propelling forward at a high rate of speed. The same thing, though, maybe it's not what happened, can occur if your projectile migrates forward in your bore.
Or maybe you don't seat it all the way off the go.
Correct. And in which case we have this huge air gap between the heel of our bullet or our sabot and then your powder column. Or if you're shooting loose powder, your powder kind of spreads out over that distance, and you don't get this nice high-pressure contained charge. You end up with this anemic woof instead of a boom.
I mean, would a very exaggerated comparison to that be like, you put powder in a case, goes boom, tons of pressure.
Yeah.
You put powder just on this table and light it on fire. It's going to...
Yeah. It's a good way to look at it. Back when I used to shoot other propellants than what I currently shoot, a common problem that I would run into was a burn ring or a carbon ring on the inside of my barrel. And when I was really new at muzzleloaders, you get a false positive of where you're seated if your carbon ring is severe enough.
Oh, sure.
So you run the ball down and you feel this resistance and to some degree a stop. And you're like, oh, well, that's the bottom. Give it a push, pull your ramrod out, and you go. And that carbon ring could be up to a couple of inches in front of where that bullet would normally seat, depending on the load and the gun. And then you introduce this error where it seems like your projectile walked forward. In fact, it just never was seated far enough. And the result is much the same. You pull the trigger and it goes swoof, and then that ball just kind of flies out of the barrel, not fast. So
would that be a good reason to potentially mark your ramrod?
Oh, yes. And also safety, like double charging a muzzleloader. We see this come. We see this come through the inbox every single year. Somebody has inadvertently double charged a muzzleloader. It turns into a nuclear device, and their optic, hopefully that's the worst of it, gets destroyed when the gun goes completely into pieces. So if you mark your ramrod, you can prevent getting a short seat on the projectile. You can also prevent a double charge. So these are things that we want to be cognizant of.
I would say if you're with somebody who is, and maybe this is just a me thing because like I can get easily distracted.
Sure.
Like if I'm ever like loading my muzzleloader, please don't talk to me.
Sure.
Because we don't want to double charge it.
Yeah.
We also don't want to think that we've poured powder down the barrel, push a bullet on top,
and then pour
of nothing,
and then pour. Oh yeah, right.
Or push a bullet in, put powder on top. I mean, there's a process to like you want to complete the process.
Yeah. Back on thermal cycling, which is what I think the working theory is on your misfire. So that exposure to hot, cold, and then the accumulating and trapping of condensation on all points of the firearm. So not just the powder and what we'll call the chamber on the inside, but your breech plug, the exterior of the gun. Inevitably, it's going to happen, right? So you had been hunting cold weather. You get into a warm truck. The gun does not have time to slowly come up to temperature. Instead, your truck is warm. You get in there, you have condensation. Conversely, you go from warm to cold. A similar thing can happen. If you can avoid that will do wonderful things for you.
Now, I would say a good way to avoid that would be to have, maybe like a nice soft case that you can throw in the back of your pickup. And when you get back to the truck, remove your primer.
Yep.
Throw that in the back of the pickup. That's going to be, essentially exterior temps. And you ought to be, pretty well off.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Mark, Jim, and I had hunted Nebraska several years ago, and it was colder than crazy, snowing like mad. And I said, hey, we're going to load cold. We're going to stay cold.
Yep.
So we loaded the guns in the field, and then they lived in the back of the truck the whole time.
This was, 4 days total? Something like
yeah,
that? Something like that.
And Jim had shot his buck right there, that one on the table, I think morning 3.
I thought it was earlier than that.
No. Because the last day, the day we pulled out, was the day that I shot, but I missed.
Yeah.
Which I think was morning 4.
Mm-hmm.
But load cold, stay cold.
And when we're talking, that was a long poke with very accurate Muzzy, but
yeah. And if you do that, if you stay away from that thermal cycling, you stand a better chance of not corrupting or polluting your powder charge with moisture, which could result in this. Now, that's one failure mode in a muzzleloader. Another one that I commonly see is at the breech plug level. Some muzzleloaders, a lot of muzzleloaders these days, modern inlines, you might have an opportunity for 2 breech plugs. And so I'm going to pick on CVA, whom I think makes probably the best production class muzzleloader under $1,000.
I would agree
on
with
the market. So I've got a couple of CVA Accurate MRs. We've got, 20 of them here between and amongst all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And you can order them with a Blackhorn 209 breech plug or without. And if you shoot Blackhorn 209, so this is more of an optimization of breech plug to powder type that you're using. If you do plan on shooting Blackhorn 209 and you're not using a Blackhorn 209 breech plug, inadvertently perhaps you are extending what's called your flame gap. So from the face of the primer where the fire comes out to the powder column. And in a non-Blackhorn 209 breech plug, it's like 1.25 inches, maybe a little bit under that. And that's a long jump for that flame to get to that powder. And it's through a very small flash hole. And you may lack the tenacity in or ferociousness in the priming compound to even ignite that powder. So if you are going to shoot Blackhorn 209 propellant, make sure that your breech plug is capable of handling Blackhorn 209 propellant appropriately. And it's a very easy thing to distinguish with them. If you look at a Blackhorn 209 breech plug, they have like a distinct dish in them, like a deep, I think a dish is underwhelming to describe it. It's like a recession in the plug where the powder will actually flow down into the plug itself by almost 1/2 inch, maybe around that, shortening up that flame gap. And that's paramount. So every year, inevitably, somebody either comes to a hunter site in, they're shooting Blackhorn, they have a non-compatible breech plug, they are more likely to see misfires than they are actual successful ignitions. And that's at room temperature. If it gets cold, that just exacerbates, it gets worse. So matching your breech plug with the propellant that you plan on shooting, paramount. On breech plugs, breech plug maintenance is also something that we should be cognizant of. Again, this is probably more so for the shooters out there that are shooting stuff like 777, Pyrex, White Hots, American Pioneer, American Select. I think that's what that was called. Anything other than Blackhorn, you'll get like a carbon deposit that can choke out or totally obscure your flash hole in your breech plug. And back when I used to shoot exclusively 777, either pelletized or loose, breech plug maintenance was a thing. Like I had a very small probe that I would go out there and bust loose this carbon deposit in my breech plug so that I knew that I was going to get good flame into there. So when you're done with your muzzleloader for the year and you clean it all out, which I'm sure we all do here, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Wink, nudge, nudge. Don't skip your breech plug. It's not just a wipe down. It's clean that thing out. I've actually found a really good technique in boiling my breech plug. It softens up all that crud in there, and then I can get in there with a little pick, and I can scrape that loose and make sure that flash hole is clear and free of obstruction and carbon deposit or debris. Within the breech plug, too, we got to talk about primers. So on the muzzleloader scene, and we've talked about this in the past, you could look at there as being, at least with modern inlines anyways, 209 ignitions, 2 different primers. You have standard shotgun, and then you have muzzleloader primers. it should be observed that muzzleloader primers are typically muted performance, intentionally so.
Right.
If you do a mismatch where you're using a muted performance primer, like a muzzleloader primer, with a volatile powder like Blackhorn 209, you may encounter failure to ignite. It generally doesn't have a negative effect if you use a shotgun primer on loose Blackhorn, because it's going to light it up, or not loose Blackhorn, loose, say 777 or loose Pyrodex. It's going to touch that off just fine. If you're shooting pelletized 777 or pelletized Pyrodex, go with those muted performance primers. Those are intentional, and it's well thought out. Mm-hmm. They have a tendency to push the bullet forward in the, we'll call it the chamber of the muzzleloader, and then ignite the powder. And we end up with a varying pressure band that occurs in there, and then your shot-to-shot performance is going to be wildly erratic. So those muted performance primers are actually quite keen when you're shooting pelletized, say 777, for instance.
Yep. And I think they generally say something of like muzzleloader primers.
Yep, correct.
Which could potentially be, if you didn't see that on like your standard 209 shotgun primer, you might be like, are these going to work? It's like, well, yes, but just make sure. Actually, that's my first note here. Use the right primer for your powder.
Yeah.
And I think that's, just make sure whatever you're using, you have it matched up correctly.
And the long and short of it is, if you shoot pelletized, shoot the muzzleloader primers. If you shoot loose or Blackhorn, which is loose, shoot the full snooze primers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mark, you have a couple of other things on there that are important.
Well, we talked about, so I'm going to go back to, you were talking about breech plugs earlier, and cleaning them, which is extremely important. But, one thing I do these days is, if I'm going to put like if you and I were in the field and we're like, we're going muzzleloader hunting, and we're getting ready to load our muzzleloader in the field. The firearm is whatever the air temp is that day. I'm going to bust a few caps.
Oh, yeah.
Through, particularly, maybe I did clean the muzzleloader recently, something like that. I'm just going to make sure that I'm going to bust a couple caps, hopefully blow out any sort of debris or whatever that might be in the flash hole of the breech plug.
To include cleaning solvent and oil. Yep, exactly. I'm also visually going to look for that, like exiting the barrel, like you'll see a flame, or smoke.
Or smoke, or it's gonna, you might see debris move, and not debris, but like let's say you were pointing it down at leaf litter, you're gonna see that, something like that. The other thing you talked about, Ryan, when our muzzleloaders did work on that late season snowy hunt, we taped our muzzles.
Yeah, absolutely.
So after we loaded the projectile, before priming, we taped our muzzles. And golly, I am a proponent of that.
Oh, yeah. I can't get enough of that. And you know what? We got like 10 inches of snow in the field one day. Had we not, we were bucking through all kinds of brush, from wild plum thickets to cedar stands, just a ton of crud. And we were getting snow all down our backs, and of course it's falling all over our guns. Our muzzles are sealed up. The breech and priming components are sealed up. Not a worry. None whatsoever. Totally cool with it. But we taped our muzzles. And even after we executed the shot, it was so cold that we couldn't get tape to stick to it. Remember that?
Right.
We took our gutting gloves.
That's right.
And we folded.
I forgot about that.
And we put gutting gloves over the end of the muzzles, and then we could get tape to adhere to that. And that was fine.
That's, and since then I've started using a couple rifle covers that I really like. One is the Solo Hunter rifle cover. The other one I use sometimes is Stealthy Hunter rifle cover. What they have in common, they do some of the same things a little bit differently, but they both have cover the crown of your barrel. I still tape my muzzle, though. Number one, it's possible that through whatever travels, and you're taking it on and off, maybe you get a little bit of dirt in there, maybe you get some pine needles, maybe whatever, some condensation ends up in in that crown cover, which is a very important aspect of why I use that item. But man, it's an extra layer of protection. It's a layer of protection when maybe it's snowing or raining and you go to pull your rifle out.
Yep.
You go to execute that shot. Heaven forbid you're laying prone and you push your gun forward and you push it through a little bit of a miniature snowbank in front of you.
Been there, done that.
I mean, anyway, and then also if you don't have a cover or something like that, you're carrying your rifle muzzle up, whatever. And I guess I do this for my centerfire rifles and my muzzleloaders.
Yep.
But
yep. No, that's a very keen thing. Give yourself a mechanical barrier between yourself and moisture, and you're likely to have better success. I'll say this too. A lot of times, and I run into this with metallic cartridge reloading. I do a lot of my loading in the spring and the summer months in anticipation of the fall. And I've actually made powder selections like that I am setting in stone as this is the only powder I'm going to shoot because of its inherent temperature stability across a broad swath of temperatures from -0 to 100 Fahrenheit. Something I have noticed with muzzleloaders, high performance and modern inline both, is that you may or are likely to observe interesting behavior when it gets cold. And so when I started shooting smokeless guns, I had to run a veggie wad over the top of it. And this is back a little ways. And that veggie wad, one, acted as an environmental seal, but two, helped build pressure on the ignition sequence to ensure that it detonated. Mm-hmm. And even on my Arrowhead rifle, which is the technological marvel of muzzleloading, at least in that context, if I'm going to shoot Blackhorn and I'm going to be in colder weather, so like let's say I pull my fabled New Mexico elk hunt, and I'm going to shoot Blackhorn, and I'm going to shoot that gun, I'm running a veggie wad on top of my Blackhorn, and then my bullet on top of that as an added layer of assurance. However, you can't know that unless you have an opportunity to shoot it in the cold. And you will find that occasionally cold weather does very interesting things to your mechanisms and to like the chemical reaction going off inside of that muzzleloader. And then one thing with some of these modern inlines is a lot of them have exposed hammers. And depending on how the gun is built, what that hammer's made out of, how strong is that hammer spring, whether or not your firing pin channel is getting obscured by crud and stuff like Eric had a TC Encore that he was having some issues with. We pulled the firing pin assembly out. So it's a hammer to a floating firing pin that has a rebounding spring on it. We pulled that assembly out and we found that it had been so corroded and had gotten so much crap in it that he was having misfires from the firing pin. His breech plug was clean. His bore was clean. His firing pin was the problem. If it gets cold and there's oil on there and that oil gels a little bit and that oil's on the spring or the oil's on the hammer or the mechanisms within the hammer that are allowing it to actuate and fall forward, you might slow it up. You might reduce the amount of force that you have from the hammer to the firing pin or the transfer bar or whatever mechanism that your muzzleloader is employing to detonate. So audit the mechanics as well, not just the chemical component, but also the mechanics of that muzzleloader. And in general, go sparing on the lubricants and oils. That's something I see the younger version of me. If it didn't work, just WD-40 it until it does.
Oh, just add more.
Yeah, don't do that. Definitely don't do that.
Yeah, that's like a different version of spray and pray.
Yeah, right.
It's not
That's
working. Funny. Hose it down. Okay, Ryan. I know some guys that they advocate. They're like, no matter what, like it's just part of their muzzleloading protocol.
Yeah.
They're pushing their bullet and powder out.
Sure.
Every day.
Yep.
What would be? And the answer maybe it depends, right? But like, what would be like your protocol for like, you know what, I'm going to put a new charge in?
So, it's a great question.
Because I think actually for me the answer does depend.
Yeah. When I was getting into muzzleloading and I got a little fanatical about it, I would load it and I would keep it loaded through the duration of the hunt. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I would kill a deer on the last day. Sometimes I wouldn't kill a deer. Sometimes I'd kill a deer on the first day. I never ran into a problem. But when I started shooting a patch round ball gun, I asked my hunting partner, who used to do a lot of rendezvous and shooting a lot of patch round ball. And we're moving away from a really cool product like 777 or Pyrodex or Blackhorn, and we're going to straight black. So old school powder technology. And I said, hey, and he's hunted like the Colorado primitive season and killed elk and mule deer with a 54 caliber round ball out of a Lyman Great Plains rifle. And I said, what did you do like when you were done for the day? Because you can't really take like a side lock gun like that and like remove a breech plug and pull the powder. It doesn't work like that. You got to fire it. Mm-hmm. Or you got to put like a ball screw down there or a patchworm and yank everything out and then pour it down the barrel. It's a disaster in general.
I think I would just, shoot the...
Yeah. And he said he would let it go for like a day or two, depending on the weather. If he was in crappy, cruddy weather, he's discharging the arm.
Right.
And then he is recharging it before he hunts. And then going out and hunting, and if it's crappy, cruddy weather, discharging the arm, so on and so forth. He said if he had mild weather and it was dry, then, a day or two, and he wasn't worried about it. I've not been in a position with that particular gun to have to do that, which is good, I suppose. But, I mean, so like Blackhorn is a really interesting propellant, and a lot of us now are shooting Blackhorn. Mm-hmm. It's remarkably resilient to moisture incursion. It's not moisture proof, but it's remarkably resilient. And so long as you didn't thermal cycle, I think I'd sleep soundly at night saying that's probably a contained unit and it's probably safe. Mm-hmm. If you were adamant about pulling your breech plug and knocking out your ball and powder, so be it. I don't think you're going to hurt anything other than you're going to have a little bit of a mess on your hands when you yank the plug out. It may be just as well to fire the weapon.
Right.
Yeah. Because then you're going to burn all that stuff up and there's not much to concern yourself with.
Well, and then, honestly, we talked about, busting a few caps.
Yep.
That's like the big boy version of doing that. Correct. At the same time, too. So,
correct.
You're not, I guess you'd be out a bullet.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe the hunting unit that you're in, if you're sleeping on top of game, maybe you don't want to touch one off.
Sure.
Maybe you don't want to draw the attention of the game warden who says, hey, why did you fire your weapon after dark? Because that's not legal. And so if you pull your breech plug and you dump your powder and you knock your bullet out, yeah. And I've done it before, either because I had to because something got goofed up or like I'm not in a position in which I can fire the weapon. It is a mess when you pull that breech plug out of there, especially with loose powder. With pellets, it's not a big deal at all. But 777, Pyrodex, or Blackhorn, when you dump that charge out, every thread where your breech plug goes is now coated in granular structure of powder. And then you can't put your breech plug back in. So you got to clean your breech plug threads out. And then you're pushing, some sort of anti-seize component all over the place. And it's a disaster. If you have a clean and easy way to do it, sure. If not, and you wanted to definitely start fresh, I think it'd be better to just discharge the firearm.
I think that's where where I would lean as well. And again, like I said, it depends. Like, have I had just bluebird weather? Have I been able to maintain the consistency of temperature and firearm storage? Did I tape my muzzle? Yep. All those things come into play. But I can tell you this, from now on, if I've got a little bit of a confidence waiver, maybe I shot my muzzleloader and I missed, and I didn't have extra tape, and it was raining, and I reloaded my muzzleloader.
Yep. Yeah.
But something to think about. I mean, I'd say better safe than sorry.
True.
If you've got some question marks.
True. Yeah, and that is kind of the nice part about it. It's like you can always start over.
Right. Yeah, and that goes for did somebody come up and talk to me, and did I pour that charge down the barrel?
Yeah.
You can always start over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that cover it, Ryan?
I think so, yeah. I mean, proper firearms maintenance is going to be a good thing. Know your components, what they're capable of, and where they struggle. And put a little bit of forethought into this, especially with like your breech plug, your primer style, your powder style. And if you do that homework ahead of time, you're not likely to run into any issues. Thankfully, and I aside from one time on the range, I've never had a misfire on a muzzleloader. The one I had on the range, I'm mostly positive was just completely degraded powder, because it was like, shoo, And then I watched that 300 and it was those. Remember those FPBs we used to shoot?
Oh yeah,
big 350, just dum down the range.
yeah,
And so I think that was polluted powder.
yeah. When on that deer hunt that we were talking about at the opening of the podcast, like I was in a blind,
Yeah.
like a box blind, so like the sound is always a little bit different there anyway.
Yeah.
But it was just like, thump.
Yeah.
It was,
almost makes a sound. Yeah.
and I was like, that's not right.
Yeah. That's a good sound bite.
But yeah. And then the one issue I had on the range one time, I was no fault of the bullet. I really liked. They don't make those FPBs anymore, but that's what it was. And I didn't. I thought the bullet was seated, and I think it was close to being seated,
but not quite.
But it wasn't quite.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it just got a weird
pressure.
Weird pressure there. So all right. Well, awesome, Ryan. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully this answers some of your muzzleloading misfire prevention questions, or at least, maybe you're thinking about what your process is going to be this fall. And outside of that, good luck.
Yeah.
We'll catch you on the next one.
See you.
Bye.